So today's episode is divided into two parts. The first part is on the regulation of blood pressure. And once we understand the basic physiological regulation of the blood pressure, we'll develop the principles by which high blood pressure or hypertension can be treated. As usual, we'll start with a few MCQ questions to initiate discussion. And I request all of you to participate. It doesn't matter if the question answers are wrong. So let us start with the first 5 questions. This is your first question. If P is equal to cardiac output into peripheral resistance, what does P stand for? A. Systolic blood pressure. B. Diastolic blood pressure. C. Pulse pressure. D. Mean arterial pressure. Next question. There's a statement that baroreceptors respond best to rising pressure than static elevated pressure. That means if someone's pressure rises from 130 to 150 millimeter of mercury, that's rising pressure. And someone's blood pressure is at 150 millimeter of mercury for a number of days. So baroreceptors respond better to which one? So you answer A for true and B for the statement is false. Let's move on to the next question. Hering's nerve is a branch of which major nerve? Next question. Low pressure baroreceptors are located in arch of aorta, carotid sinus, wall of atria, and internal carotid artery. The last question of this section. Long-term control of blood pressure is mediated by which one? A. Baroreceptor reflex. B. Chemoreceptor reflex. C. Natriuretic peptides. D. CNS ischemic response. Okay, thank you for the participation. Let us start with the discussion on these topics and we'll come back to these questions. So we know that blood pressure refers to the lateral pressure that is exerted on the wall of the blood vessel by the flowing blood. When blood flows, there is a forward pressure as well as lateral pressure. Forward pressure cannot be measured by sphygmomanometry. They have to be measured by invasive methods. Since we use sphygmomanometer for measurement of blood pressure, we actually measure the lateral pressure, the pressure perpendicular to the wall of the blood vessel. So blood pressure is defined as the lateral pressure exerted on the wall of the blood vessels by flowing blood. When we speak about blood pressure, it's very important to understand how the pressure gets transmitted in the form of a pulse wave. We will discuss in detail about pulse in an episode that is dedicated totally to the discussion of pulse. But today we have to understand certain very basic facets about the pulse wave. So these are the pressure changes that occur on the wall of the arteries during the cardiac cycle. Let us see what these different parts of the pulse wave represent. You can see that during systole, there is a sharp rise in pressure. This sharp rise in pressure causes a positive wave, and this is known as the tidal wave or the percussion wave. The tidal wave or the percussion wave is caused by the contraction of the left ventricle. And this causes transmission of the pressure wave. Now, when the systole ends, the aortic valve closes. This closure causes a fall in pressure which is called the dicrotic notch. So the dicrotic notch is produced by the closure of the aortic valve. As blood tries to come back, but the aortic valve is already closed, so it reflects on the closed aortic valve and moves forward by Windkessel effect. And this reflection of the residual blood causes a second smaller positive wave, the dicrotic wave. Now, what is important in this pulse wave is that you can also see that the pressure changes throughout the cardiac cycle. As the pressure changes throughout the cardiac cycle, so the highest pressure that is recorded during the systole that corresponds to this pressure is known as the systolic blood pressure. So systolic blood pressure is a single value. It is not a summation of all pressure in systole. It is the highest pressure that is recorded during left ventricular systole. Similarly, we also get a baseline, which is basically the lowest pressure. This lowest pressure is recorded during diastole, and the lowest pressure recorded during diastole is known as diastolic blood pressure. So the highest pressure during systole is called systolic blood pressure, and the lowest pressure during diastole is called diastolic blood pressure. You can see that the height of the wave, which is represented here by this line, this height is basically the amplitude of the pulse wave. And the amplitude can be simply calculated by subtracting the diastolic blood pressure from the systolic blood pressure. The difference between the two pressure is the amplitude of the pulse. It determines how forcefully the pulse can be felt. And this is also known as the pulse pressure. To find out the pulse pressure, we have to subtract the diastolic blood pressure from the systolic blood pressure. This gives us the difference of pressure at which the blood is flowing and determines the strength of the pulse, which in medical terminologies is called the pulse volume. There is one interesting concept that if we can take a algebraical average of all the pressures throughout the cardiac cycle, then what will be the summated mean of the pressure be? Honestly, if that has to be done, we have to find the value by using integral calculus. But for a very simple version of doing this, we can do it in this way also. Systole usually is, if you see this graph, you will be able to understand that the systole and diastole, this graph is not to scale, but at least we can understand that systole is relatively shorter and diastole is relatively longer. As a result of this, the systolic and diastolic pressures will not contribute equally to the mean arterial blood pressure. So the mean arterial blood pressure, in a very arithmetic version of the calculation without using integral calculus, we can say is approximately equal to 1/3 of the systolic blood pressure. So 1/3 of the value is contributed by the systolic blood pressure, and 2/3 of the value is contributed by the diastolic blood pressure. Now, if we try to summate these things, So 1/3 of systolic blood pressure and 2/3 of diastolic blood pressure is here. Now, if we want to convert this calculation into a different form of calculation, then the calculation stands out like this. You take 1/3 common and it becomes systolic blood pressure plus twice diastolic blood pressure. Now, this again can be rewritten. This can be rewritten as we can actually introduce the term SBP minus DBP here. So SBP minus DBP plus 3 DBP. I think you understood the calculation. I just introduced a minus DBP and plus DBP, and this is how the calculation comes out to be. Now, this comes to 1/3 of the first two can be compounded into pulse pressure. And then we have 3 dBp, 3 diastolic blood pressure. Now divide the whole thing by 3 and you get mean arterial blood pressure is equal to diastolic blood pressure, that is 1/3 into 3, that's 1, plus 1/3 of pulse pressure. So this is an arithmetic version of the complex calculation that can be derived by using integral calculus, and it gives fairly accurate result. So pulse pressure uh, uh, is a component that we have introduced here to explain mean arterial blood pressure. So mean arterial blood pressure represents the average blood pressure, the algebraic mean of the blood pressure throughout the cardiac cycle. And it can be calculated by adding 1/3 of pulse pressure to diastolic blood pressure. What is very interesting is that when we use the concept that blood pressure is equal to cardiac output into peripheral resistance, then also the concept of mean arterial blood pressure becomes important, which we shall discuss. So as I told you, SBP is the maximum pressure during systole, DBP is the minimum pressure during diastole, pulse pressure is the amplitude of the pulse wave, which is SBP minus DBP, and mean arterial blood pressure can be calculated I'm sorry, there is a misprint here. It will be pulse, it will be diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 pulse pressure. There has been a typing mistake, so let me correct this also. Uh, so this will be DBP plus 1/3 of pulse pressure. So these are the basic annotations of different kinds of blood pressure. Am I audible to everyone? Please write yes or no. Okay, so those who cannot hear me, maybe they can log in once more. Maybe the connection has been interrupted. Moving on. So as I was saying, that conventionally we say that blood pressure is equal to cardiac output into peripheral resistance. Let us first understand where this comes from, and then we will go into understanding what this actually stands for. So when we say blood pressure is equal to cardiac output into peripheral resistance, this can of course be derived from the Poiseuille-Hagen formula. But instead of getting into hemodynamic details, which is our topic of discussion tomorrow, we can also understand it analogically by the concept of flow of electricity. In an ohmic conductor, when electricity flows, it obeys Ohm's law, which is V is equal to I into R, where V is the potential difference. So if this is a conductor and there are two terminals of the conductor, and the potential difference between these two terminals, if that can be calculated as V. So suppose this is point number 1. So we have a potential of V1 here and a potential of V2 here. And let us understand that V2 minus V1 is equal to V. for our discussion. And the amount of current that is flowing through this ohmic conductor, if that amount of current is I, and the resistance of the circuit is R, then we understand that V is equal to I into R. In a similar manner, fluid flows from high pressure to low pressure, very similar to the electrical potential. So you can easily understand that uh, pressure in a fluid is also similar to the gravitational potential that has been already stored. So elastic or gravitational potential also obeys the same law, that the substance should flow from higher potential to lower potential. So in this case, as an analogy, if we see, let's assume this is a blood vessel, and in this blood vessel there is a pressure difference at which blood is flowing, and the difference of pressure are P1 and P2. And let's assume by the same analogy that the pressure difference P2 minus P1, which is the mean difference throughout the cardiac cycle, is P. The amount of blood that is flowing per unit time, analogical to the current I, we can call this flow. And flow per unit time, one of the good measure of that is the cardiac output. That is the flow per minute. When we talk of resistance, the resistance that we talk about in the blood vessel is the peripheral resistance. So by simple analogy with Ohm's law, we can understand that V can be replaced by P, which is the blood pressure. Flow or I can be substituted with cardiac output, and the R can be replaced by peripheral resistance. So it's a very analogous mechanism by which blood flows, and it actually can be compared with ohmic flow of electricity. I hope this concept is clear. So when we use the word blood pressure here, the concept of blood pressure that we use here is the pressure all across the vascular tree, the gradient along which blood is flowing. And this is best represented by the mean arterial blood pressure. So when we use the formula Bp equal to cardiac output into peripheral resistance, this formula most accurately describes the mean arterial blood pressure, neither systolic blood pressure nor diastolic blood pressure. So I hope this analogy is clear to all of us. This concept that blood pressure is equal to cardiac output into peripheral resistance is a basis of understanding how blood pressure values can be adjusted by the body. We know that blood pressure changes under different situations. Anything that changes the cardiac output or the peripheral resistance will change the blood pressure. Let us see what are the factors that can change the cardiac output. The cardiac output, as we know, is heart rate multiplied by the stroke volume. It is heart rate times stroke volume. That is amount of blood per beat into number of beat. That is the cardiac output or minute volume. Now, stroke volume and heart rate can also be altered by various factors. We know that heart rate can be altered by several factors. For example, autonomic supply, that is sympathetic will reduce it and sympathetic will increase it and parasympathetic will reduce it. Effect of exercise, effect of sleep. So all these factors influence the heart rate. The stroke volume again depends on various factors, and we have seen that the stroke volume essentially is a function of contractility of the heart and is also regulated by Frank Sterling's principle, and therefore it depends on the preload. Now, the preload depends on the venous return. The venous return depends on the return of the blood, that is the mean systolic filling pressure. And this will depend again on various other factors like the pumping activity of the muscle, effect of gravity, effect of the negative pressure due to respiration, and so many factors will influence this. Contractility can be again affected by positive and negative ionotropic factors. Now, peripheral resistance primarily depends on the radius of the vessel. It also depends on the viscosity of blood, but let's assume that the viscosity remains within a range in physiological condition. So it mostly depends on the vascular radius. And maximum amount of the resistance is in the bed of the arterioles. And the vascular radius again can be controlled by vasoconstrictors and vasodilators. So ultimately, all these factors which influence the cardiac output and the peripheral resistance indirectly influence the blood pressure. So I hope again this is clear to everyone. So anything that has an ability to change these factors will also change the blood pressure. Now, looking at this, it might sound very simplistic to think that therefore, if heart rate increases, then cardiac output will increase and then blood pressure will increase. While this is true to some extent, it is not always true. So let us understand where exception to this rule can happen. When we plot the cardiac output against heart rate, we see that within a limit, the cardiac output increases with heart rate, which is obvious because if the heart rate increases, then heart rate multiplied by stroke volume, that also increases. Thereafter, as the heart rate increases, the cardiac output starts to decrease. Why does this happen? Because if the heart is beating very fast, then the duration of systole and diastole also become very less. As the diastolic duration decreases, the ventricles cannot fill properly. There is less time for the ventricle to receive blood. That means the end diastolic volume or preload becomes less. Then again by Frank Sterling's principle, the cardiac output becomes less. So up to a heart rate of around 100 or 120, the cardiac output will increase. Thereafter, it will start to decrease. And after a heart rate of 150 per minute, the cardiac output definitely decreases. So that is what I was trying to say, that we should not oversimplify by thinking that increase in heart rate always increases the blood pressure. Excessive rise in the heart rate can also cause a decrease in the blood pressure. So is it clear up to this? Fine. So now we move on to the regulation of blood pressure. So how is the blood pressure regulated? The blood pressure can be regulated by short-term mechanisms that operate in seconds to minutes, and by long-term mechanisms that can operate over days, weeks, or months. And there are also some minor mechanisms that operate all through. We will mainly discuss the short-term and the long-term mechanisms today in a nutshell. The short-term mechanism, they are mostly reflexes. They are baroreceptor reflex, chemoreceptor reflex, and CNS ischemic response. A special type of that is also called Cushing's reflex. Long-term regulation involves the renal mechanism where kidney maintains the blood pressure, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, antidiuretic hormone mechanism, and atrial natriuretic peptide mechanism. Ultimately, all these mechanisms act on the kidney. So we can safely say that kidney is the most important organ for long-term regulation of the blood pressure. Apart from this, we have some other postulated mechanisms like capillary fluid shift and stress relaxation. Let us go one by one into the discussion of these mechanisms. So we'll first come to the baroreceptor reflex. So what are baroreceptors? Baroreceptors are essentially stretch receptors. So baroreceptors are receptors of stretch. They are stretch receptors. And they respond to stretching of the wall of the blood vessel. So when the blood pressure increases, the lateral pressure increases. So wall of the blood vessel is stretched. That stretch is felt by the cells in these baroreceptors and they generate action potential. Baroreceptors are present in different parts of the body. The high pressure baroreceptor, which are the baroreceptor, are mainly present in the carotid sinus, that is the carotid sinus receptors, and the arch of aorta, which are called the aortic arch receptors. They are present in the adventitial layer of the blood vessels. So whenever blood pressure increases, the adventitia is stretched and therefore these receptors are also stretched. So we have the receptors in three locations, the two carotid sinuses and the arch of the aorta. Each of them are supplied by sensory nerves that carry the impulse to the brain. The carotid sinus is supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve, that is the ninth cranial nerve. The arch of aorta is supplied by the vagus nerve. So the nerve supply of the two different types of baroreceptors are different. Ninth nerve supplies the carotid sinus receptors, and 10th nerve or vagus nerve supplies the aortic arch receptors. Now, uh, if you go in detail into the nature of these nerve supplies, you will see that uh, the nerves that enter the carotid sinus, these nerves are a small branch that comes from the glossopharyngeal nerve. In case of the aorta, it is a branch of the vagus nerve. The branch of the vagus that supplies the arch of aorta is called aortic depressor nerve. And the branch of the glossopharyngeal which supplies the carotid sinus is called sinus nerve. Also, it is known as the Hering's nerve. So, Hering's nerve is a branch of the ninth cranial nerve or glossopharyngeal nerve. These nerves will sense the change in the pressure, generate action potential, and transmit the signal to the brain. Let us now see how rise in the pressure will affect this reflex. So this is the pathway of the reflex. It can look complicated, but it is a very easy reflex. So follow me as I denote the pathway with arrows. In any reflex, we must know a starting point. So the starting point is rise in blood pressure. So what happens when blood pressure rises? Let us see. When the blood pressure rises, the nerves in the carotid sinus and the aortic arch, they get stimulated. Carotid sinus carries the impulse through the ninth cranial nerve. Aortic arch carries this impulse through the 10th cranial nerve or the vagus nerve. Although their routes are different, their destination are same. They will ultimately go to the medulla oblongata. In the medulla oblongata, there are different nerve nuclei. Nuclei are clusters of cell bodies. And these nuclei together, all of them together are known as the vasomotor center. Now, what are the components of the vasomotor center? These nerves will first terminate in the nucleus tractus solitarius or the nucleus of the solitary tract. From there, connection will go to another set of nuclei. These are known as the caudal ventrolateral medulla and intermedio ventrolateral medulla. After reaching there, finally the nerve will supply another nucleus called the rostral ventrolateral medulla. So there are three nuclei that form the vasomotor center. Nucleus tractus solitarius, the caudal and intermediolateral medulla, and the rostral ventrolateral medulla. So what is the effect of this stimulation? The final effect is if there is rise in blood pressure, this is the starting point. So the starting point is rise in blood pressure. And the rise in blood pressure causes a strong inhibition of the rostral ventrolateral medulla. So the rostral ventrolateral medulla is inhibited. the minus sign represents inhibition. So on both sides, the rostral ventrolateral medulla will be inhibited. What is the normal function of this rostral ventrolateral medulla? Normally, the rostral ventrolateral medulla increases sympathetic output. So when it is inhibited, the sympathetic output decreases. So there was a rise in BP. Impulse goes to the nucleus tractus solitarius, to the caudal and intermedio ventrolateral medulla, finally to the rostral ventrolateral medulla. There the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA is secreted. So what does it cause? It causes inhibition of the rostral ventrolateral medulla. And inhibition of the rostral ventrolateral medulla will ultimately cause decrease in the sympathetic outflow. I am showing the decrease with a blue color. So now instead of increase, there will be a decrease in the sympathetic outflow. Normally, where does this sympathetic outflow go? Normally, this outflow stimulates the adrenal medulla, causing it to release adrenaline, causes constriction of the arterioles, increasing the peripheral resistance, and it stimulates the heart to pump faster. So normally this pathway would have stimulated release of catecholamine, stimulated rise in peripheral resistance, and stimulated the rise in cardiac output. But now this whole pathway is inhibited at the level of rostral ventrolateral medulla. As a result, this lack of stimulation will cause reduced vasoconstriction, which means vasodilation, reduced release of catecholamine, and reduced beating of the heart. And ultimately, the response will be a decrease in the blood pressure. So we started with increase in blood pressure and we end up in decrease in blood pressure. And the most important center for this regulation is the rostral ventrolateral medulla located in the medulla oblongata. So I think this is clear to everyone. And this is the baroreceptor reflex. Baroreceptor reflex is not stimulated by fall in pressure, but fall in pressure also operates here. How? Imagine there is a fall in pressure. Now I will be speaking in negative words. So there is no impulse going from carotid sinus. No impulse is going from aortic arch. So no impulse reaches the NTS. No impulse reaches the caudal ventrolateral medulla, and therefore no one inhibits the rostral ventrolateral medulla. This lack of inhibition causes increased sympathetic output. So ultimately there is release of catecholamine, constriction of arteriole, and stimulation of the heart. So the blood pressure will rise. So we can say that the baroreceptor reflex decreases a high blood pressure, whereas lack of the baroreceptor reflex causes low blood pressure to rise. Is this absolutely clear to everyone? Okay. So in summary, this is what happens. There is an increase in blood pressure. It stretches the baroreceptors. Impulse goes through the 9th and 10th nerve, and impulse reaches the nucleus tractus solitarius. This causes inhibition of the vasomotor center, which is mainly the rostral ventrolateral medulla. There is inhibition of sympathetic outflow. So there is vasodilation and reduced myocardial contractility, and this decreases the blood pressure. One pathway that has not been shown in the previous diagram is it also causes stimulation of the vagus nerve, which is parasympathetic, so the heart rate also decreases. So this is how the baroreceptor reflex operates. As it operates in seconds, it's a very important mediator of short-term control of blood pressure. Low pressure baroreceptors are present on the wall of the atria, right atrium and left atrium, and also in cardiopulmonary vessels, mainly the pulmonary veins. They do not operate based on change in pressure. They instead operate based on the change in volume of blood. So they operate when blood volume increases, and they help in reducing the pressure when blood volume increases. The next one is chemoreceptor reflex. Before I begin to talk about chemoreceptor reflex, one thing should be very clear to everyone. Chemoreceptor reflex is not very important for blood pressure regulation. It has a minor role in blood pressure regulation. It is actually most important to regulate respiration. Regulation of blood pressure is a byproduct of the reflex. So, thinking in a very teleological manner, this reflex probably was not meant to control blood pressure. It is mainly meant to control the respiratory system. But along with the respiratory system, it also controls the blood pressure values. So what are chemoreceptors? These are receptors present on aorta and carotid, but not in the carotid sinus. You can see they are present outside. And they have different names. They are not called carotid baroreceptor. They are called carotid body. Similarly, they are called aortic body. And these are receptors that can sense chemical changes in the blood. Namely, they can sense the change in oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH. Now, this is an enlarged diagram of the same thing. You can see that the sinus nerve innervates the carotid sinus, the baroreceptors, and outside this there is this carotid body. It is outside the vessel. This carotid body contains the chemoreceptors that sense the changes in chemical composition of the blood, mainly the respiratory gases. Under the microscope, they are found to have cells like this, and these cells are called glomus cells. The type 1 glomus cells are the actual chemoreceptors, and they are stimulated by hypoxia. When they are stimulated, they generate impulse into the glossopharyngeal nerve or ninth nerve, and the ninth nerve is responsible for carrying the impulse from the carotid body and ultimately mediate the chemoreceptor reflex. Now, what is the chemoreceptor reflex? If oxygen decreases in the body, this reflex tries to increase oxygen delivery to the tissue. So it is a compensatory mechanism. If oxygen delivery to the tissue decreases, it will increase the oxygen delivery. How does it happen? So we can start from this point where the start leveling is done. Suppose a person has high level of carbon dioxide and low level of pH and oxygen. Once this happens, the chemoreceptors are stimulated. They understand there is less oxygen and more carbon dioxide in the body. Once this happens, they will stimulate the respiratory center in the medulla oblongata and increase the respiratory rate. By increasing the respiratory rate, what will happen is there will be an increase in ventilation, and therefore more and more oxygen will go to the body. On the other hand, oxygen has gone into the blood, but finally the blood has to go to the tissue. So it also stimulates the cardiovascular center. It causes increased cardiac output, vasoconstriction, and therefore rise in the blood pressure. But you can understand that here the change in the blood pressure or blood flow is essentially to deliver more oxygen into the different parts of the body. The primary aim is to correct oxygen deficit and not the pressure. But as a side effect of this, the blood pressure rises. So hypoxia can cause a rise in the blood pressure. So I hope this is clear to all of you. There is another interesting response which is known as the CNS ischemic response. Whenever there is reduced blood flow to the brain, that is called cerebral hypoxia, the vasomotor center is stimulated. Hypoxia is a powerful stimulus for the vasomotor center. And once the vasomotor center is stimulated, this increases sympathetic discharge, which causes increase in blood pressure and blood flow. This is called CNS ischemic response. There are different causes of ischemia to the CNS that can happen due to loss of blood, hypoxia, a tumor compressing on a vessel. One important cause of ischemia to the CNS is increase in the pressure of cerebrospinal fluid, that is raised intracranial tension, because that also compresses the blood vessel. If there is ischemia to the CNS due to rise in CSF pressure, then also the same mechanism happens. But that particular special condition is also known by another name, that is Cushing's reflex. So Cushing's reflex or Cushing's reaction refers to the phenomenon that if there is an increased intracranial tension that compresses the cerebral blood vessels, this will ultimately cause an increase in the peripheral blood pressure. So I hope this again is clear to all of you. Coming to the long-term regulations, long-term regulation is mediated by the kidney. Before we talk about the kidney, let's understand one mechanism by which the kidney operates the blood pressure. And that is the renin-angiotensin system. Renin-angiotensin system is a very interesting interconnected system of blood pressure and blood volume control. So whenever there is low blood pressure, which causes less blood supply to the kidney, so if there is less blood flow to kidney or sympathetic stimulation, which can also happen due to the other reflexes. This causes stimulation of beta 1 adrenergic receptors on juxtaglomerular cells. The juxtaglomerular cells, in response to this, release an enzyme called renin. Renin, truly speaking, is not probably a hormone because it is more enzyme in nature. It is a proteolytic enzyme. It is a protease that splits the plasma protein angiotensinogen into a smaller protein, angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is inactive and it is converted by another enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme into the active fragment angiotensin 2. This conversion happens in different parts of the body wherever there are ACE production, which are present on the wall of the blood vessels. And it is maximally concentrated in lungs. But it is not only converted in lung, it is also converted in kidney and other vascular beds. This angiotensin 2 has different activities. The most important receptor on which it works is the AT1 receptor. So it acts on AT1 receptor of angiotensin. And as a result of this, three different responses happen. One response is a direct vasoconstriction and sodium water absorption, which are functions of angiotensin itself. Angiotensin, by the way, is also one of the most potent vasoconstrictors. The second response is release in aldosterone. And the third one is a release of antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin. Aldosterone can also cause sodium and water reabsorption. And antidiuretic hormone has two different effects. The antidiuretic action causes water absorption, and the vasopressin action causes vasoconstriction. The net effect is increase in sodium water of the body, which increases the cardiac output, and vasoconstriction, which increases the peripheral resistance. So finally, the blood pressure rises. So this is how a falling blood pressure can respond with the help of the renin-angiotensin system. This is a very important target of long-term blood pressure regulation, as a result of which drugs have been developed to modify this system. One important drug that can inhibit the beta 1 receptor are the beta blockers, like propranolol. The beta blockers can therefore prevent the release of renin. The action of renin can be inhibited by renin antagonists like aliskiren. The enzyme ACE can be inhibited by ACE inhibitors like enalapril. The activity of angiotensin 2 can be blocked by angiotensin receptor blockers like losartan. The activity of aldosterone can be blocked by aldosterone antagonist like spironolactone. Activity of antidiuretic hormone can be blocked by ADH antagonists like tolvaptan. So with so many targets of action, we can actually target the renin-angiotensin system for alteration in blood pressure, alteration in blood volume, and alteration in the sodium level of the body. I hope this is clear to everyone. So in summary, this is what happens. Sympathetic stimulation or fall in pressure or reduced sodium delivery stimulates the kidney to release renin. Renin sequentially converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1 and then ACE converts that into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 can directly act on the kidney. It can stimulate the release of aldosterone. It can stimulate the release of ADH. And these factors ultimately rearrange the blood volume and pressure, and ultimately blood volume and pressure increases. So this is the arrangement that can be mediated through the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. Another very important regulator of the volume and the pressure status of the body are the natriuretic peptides. You can say they are the natural diuretics of the body, and they respond to volume overload. So whenever the blood volume increases, there is distension of the cardiac chambers. Cardiac chamber distension, sympathetic stimulation, or angiotensin 2 can stimulate the heart to release a hormone. So these are hormones released by the heart. The natriuretic peptides are of two types, A type and B type. Their previous names were atrial natriuretic peptide and brain natriuretic peptide. But nowadays we have found that both peptides can be released either from heart or from brain. So instead of changing the abbreviation, we have now named them as A and B. So the A and the B type natriuretic peptides. How do they decrease the blood volume? The ANP and BNP reduce the release of renin. That way, the production of aldosterone and angiotensin 2 decreases, and this causes loss of sodium and water, decreasing the blood volume. ANP and BNP are also vasodilators. So they cause vasodilation and fall in peripheral resistance. As the volume as well as the vessel diameter changes, ultimately there is a decrease in blood pressure. So this is how natriuretic peptides work. Because again, natriuretic peptides are such novel molecules, drugs have been based on them. So we have recombinant natriuretic peptide. So molecules that resemble the natriuretic peptide. For example, we have discussed this under cardiac failure, drugs like nesiritide. And we can also inhibit the metabolism of atrial natriuretic peptide. ANP and BNP are metabolized by a group of enzymes called the neprilysin. And we have neprilysin inhibitors that can increase the lifespan of the natural ANP and BNP, and therefore they can help in reducing the blood pressure, also are useful in heart failure. To potentiate the vasodilator action, it can be combined with valsartan, an angiotensin receptor blocker. Now comes the most interesting part. that is renal regulation, how kidney regulates the blood pressure and blood volume. Of course, the previous two mechanisms, that is renin-angiotensin mechanism and the natriuretic peptide mechanism, they also operate mostly through the kidney. But kidney itself has its own mechanisms for regulation of the blood volume. If we experimentally increase the blood pressure in an animal, we will see as the blood pressure rises, urine output also increases. So the more and more sodium and water enters the body, more and more sodium and water leaves the body up to a certain limit. So in a normal person, we can say, for example, suppose the urine volume is 2 liters per day, and therefore this becomes the operating point of the person, which means if we now drop a perpendicular from here, then approximately this is the pressure at which the person's blood pressure will be maintained. So given the input, if this is the nature of the output, then the blood pressure will be maintained around, say, 118 or 116 millimeter of mercury, which is of course within the normal range. And these operating points can sometimes change. In a disease, the body can start thinking that this is the normal operating point of the body. And if that happens, then the body will readjust to change the arterial pressure urine output curve. Now, how does kidney increase urine output when blood pressure increases? Let's start from here. Let's assume there is increased extracellular fluid, that is blood volume. Increased blood volume causes increased mean circulatory filling pressure, that is venous return. If the venous return increases, then cardiac output increases. If the cardiac output increases, then the blood flow into the kidney also increases. If blood flow into the kidney increases, GFR increases, and automatically the urine output increases. Similarly, there can be an alternative mechanism. There is a reduced blood pressure. This causes release of renin. The renin now activates the renin-angiotensin system, causes sodium water retention and vasoconstriction, and increases the blood pressure. So both increase and decrease blood pressure can be affected at the level of the kidney. This is the renal regulation. An integrated circuitry of this regulation was once proposed by original experiments by Guyton, and this is a summary of that experiment. We can start reading this graph from the non-renal fluid loss and fluid intake. So due to some reason, there may be changes in extracellular volume. As extracellular volume changes, blood volume changes. That is what I was talking about right now. So the circulatory filling pressure increases. This changes the venous return. This changes the cardiac output. This changes the blood pressure. But the pressure is now buffered by the kidney, because increased pressure means increased urine output. Decreased pressure means decreased urine output. And finally, the rate of change is compensated and kidney balances the blood pressure. So this is how kidney regulates the blood pressure. I hope again this is clear to everyone. So this is a very simple diagram showing how multiple factors step by step regulate the blood pressure. Let's start from blood volume. Blood volume depends on sodium and water handling of the body. As the blood volume increases, preload increases. Now, depending on the venous return and compliance, the preload increases the stroke volume, that is Frank-Starling's law, which also depends on the contractility or ionotropy. As the stroke volume increases, the cardiac output increases, which also depends on the heart rate and the relationship between heart rate and cardiac output. As the cardiac output increases, the mean arterial blood pressure increases as a product of the vascular resistance. And this peripheral resistance depends on the anatomy of the blood vessel, the vasoactive factors, tissue factors, and neurohumoral factors. So this is an integrated regulation of the blood pressure. Anything that changes any of these factors will also affect the blood pressure. So I hope this part again is clear to you. And let us now try to answer these questions. So answer this. What does P stand for in this equation? Very good. So P stands for mean arterial blood pressure. Next question. Baroreceptors respond best to rising pressure or static pressure? Very good. The answer is A, because stretch will be most prominent when the pressure rises rather than when it is static. So A is true. Hering's nerve is a branch of which nerve? Wonderful. It is a branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve. Low pressure baroreceptors are located in which part? Wonderful. They are located on the wall of the atria. Long-term control of blood pressure is mediated by what? Very good, by the natriuretic peptides. So with this preliminary idea about how blood pressure is regulated, we'll have a very brief discussion on hypertension management. This class is not meant for the therapeutics of hypertension, but here we will discuss the principles of choice of drug in hypertension and the prescription by international bodies. Try this question. A man has a systolic blood pressure of 130 millimeter of mercury and diastolic BP of 85. What will be the category of the blood pressure? Next question. Again, a man has a systolic BP of 135 millimeter of mercury and a DBP of 108 millimeter. What will be the diagnosis? Next question. All of the following are antihypertensive drugs except which one? So which one is not an antihypertensive? Next. Renin-angiotensin system can be blocked by which one? And finally, what is the drug of choice in pregnancy-induced hypertension? Okay, so with these preliminary questions, we'll now enter the discussion of hypertension. We already know that blood pressure depends on cardiac output and peripheral resistance. Cardiac output depends on stroke volume and heart rate, whereas peripheral resistance depends on vascular structure and vascular function. Hypertension can be primary or secondary. In most cases of hypertension, we don't understand its cause, and therefore they are called primary or essential hypertension. 95% of all hypertension are primary in nature. Among the remaining 5%, The different causes of hypertension include renal disease, endocrine disease, and drugs. Now, this is the grading of hypertension proposed by Joint National Committee 7. Although newer versions of JNC are available, but for some reason, this classification is still taken to be standard with some exception in certain age groups. So I will be basing my discussion on the JNC 7. According to JNC 7, a blood pressure less than 120 by 80 is normal. When the systolic blood pressure is between 120 to less than 140 and 80 to less than 90 diastolic BP, either of these two, it is called pre-hypertension. When systolic BP is between 140 to less than 160 and diastolic BP between 90 to less than 100, that is stage 1 hypertension. And if systolic BP is more than 160 or diastolic more than 100, that is stage 2 hypertension. If there is only rise in SBP and no rise in DBP, it is called isolated systolic hypertension. Now, some people may have SBP in one category and DBP in the other category. The consensus is the higher category should be taken as the grade of hypertension. So if someone has a blood pressure of systolic BP in stage 1 level and diastolic BP in stage 2 level, then the stage of the hypertension will be stage 2 and not stage 1. That is irrespective of whether it is SBP or DBP. Why are we so afraid of hypertension? Hypertension is a sustained rise of blood pressure, which causes target organ changes in different parts of the body. It targets the brain and can cause strokes, hypertensive encephalopathy, the retina causing hypertensive retinopathy, the heart increasing the chance of myocardial infarction and hypertensive cardiomyopathy. In the blood, there may be stress-associated hyperglycemia, and in the kidneys, it can cause hypertensive nephropathy, leading to chronic kidney disease. For these reasons, hypertension should be diagnosed at the earliest and treated optimally at the earliest. Treatment should continue for the rest of the life. So now comes the final part of the discussion. What are the points, physiological operating points where the drugs can work? These categories of drugs are used to treat hypertension. Diuretics, that will remove fluid from the body. Beta blockers, alpha blockers, they block alpha 1 receptor and cause vasodilation. Central sympatholytic, these are alpha 2 agonists. Alpha 2 antagonists are not used in hypertension. Alpha 2 agonists are inhibitory agonists and therefore they reduce sympathetic outflow. ACE inhibitor, angiotensin receptor blocker, they target the renin-angiotensin system. Calcium channel blockers and direct vasodilators dilate the blood vessels. Now, let us start with this very simple diagram. We have the brain, we have the autonomic ganglion, that is the sympathetic ganglion, we have the heart, the blood vessel, and the kidney. And in the first part, we have understood how they operate, different reflexes and mechanisms to regulate the blood pressure. So these are the organs which are the targets of blood pressure control in our body. In the kidney, apart from its own renal mechanism, there is also a renin-angiotensin system, which we have already studied. This involves the renin as well as the angiotensin converting enzyme. Now let us start one by one to understand how drugs can work. The first part is the brain. In the brain, there is vasomotor center. We can inhibit the vasomotor center by giving drugs like methyl dopa or clonidine. These are alpha 2 receptor agonists. We can also use drugs like guanabens and guanfacine. Inhibition of the vasomotor center abolishes the baroreceptor reflex. Methyl dopa happens to be the safest drug in pregnancy because it is not carcinogenic. It's not teratogenic. We can also block the sympathetic ganglia, the second level of control. Trimethophan campsylate or pentolinium tartarate are different drugs that can block sympathetic ganglia, and therefore it can help in inhibiting the vessel and the heart. We can target the sympathetic nerve terminals ending on the heart or the vessel. There are some drugs which are sympathetic nerve blockers like guanethidine, guanadrel, and reserpine. They prevent the release of noradrenaline from the nerve terminals. We can target the heart itself. The beta 1 receptor of the heart can be blocked by propranolol and other beta blockers. We can target the blood vessel. In the blood vessel, angiotensin receptor, AT1 receptor, can be blocked by angiotensin receptor blockers like losartan. Alpha 1 receptor can be blocked by prazosin and similar other drugs. And the blood vessel can be directly blocked by drugs like hydralazine, minoxidil, nitroprusside, or with calcium channel blockers like amlodipine, verapamil, etc. We can also use dopaminergic vasodilators like phenoldopam that act on D1 receptor and cause vasodilation. We can act on the kidney. Diuretics like thiazide cause loss of fluid and sodium and therefore reduces the cardiac output. Loss of sodium also reduces the vascular tone and therefore reduces the peripheral resistance in the long run. We can target the renin-angiotensin system. The release of renin can be blocked by beta blocker. Renin can be inhibited by aliskiren. Angiotensin converting enzyme can be blocked by ACE inhibitors. So this in summary tells you all the drugs that can be used for the treatment of hypertension. The recommended algorithm that is proposed nowadays is if a patient has stage 1 hypertension along with lifestyle modification like low salt intake, regular exercise, add a thiazide. If it is stage 2 hypertension, you can add thiazide along with ACE inhibitor, ARB or calcium channel blocker, or you can consider ACE inhibitor plus calcium channel blocker. You review the patient. If the BP is maintained, then you continue that and encourage the patient to keep on monitoring the blood pressure. But if it is not maintained, then you make different combination, rational combination of these medicines. Most patients benefit from thiazide. Along with that, you can combine ACE inhibitor, ARB or calcium channel blockers. Again, check after a few weeks. If the BP is maintained, then you again encourage the patient to keep monitoring. And if the BP is not maintained, then you change the doses, think of secondary causes of hypertension and investigate. And if it is still not understandable why it is becoming refractory, consider referral to a hypertension specialist. So with this we end the discussion part. Let us quickly go through the MCQs. So this was our first question of this section. What will be the diagnosis here? Wonderful. The answer is prehypertension. So this is a patient of prehypertension. What will be the diagnosis in this case? Very good. As the diastolic BP is in stage 2, so this is stage 2 hypertension. Which of the following is not an antihypertensive drug? Wonderful. The answer is B. Alpha 2 agonists are antihypertensive drug, but not alpha 2 antagonists. Renin-angiotensin system can be blocked by which one? The answer will be D, all of the above. Propranolol is a beta blocker, aliskiren is a renin antagonist, and candesartan is an angiotensin receptor blocker. So answer is D, all of the above. And the last question, the drug of choice in pregnancy-induced hypertension. Very good. The answer will be D, methyl dopa. So I hope the content was clear to you and you would be able to understand the regulation of blood pressure and correlate with treatment of hypertension well.